The cattle drive that left Fort Worth in June of 1867 lost 11 men before it reached Abilene, but none of them died from bullets or drowning in swollen rivers. Charles Goodnight later testified that most succumbed to scurvy, dysentery, and what camp cooks called salt gut, a constellation of ailments traced directly to the monotonous, improvised diet that frontier cowboys endured for months at a time. What exactly were these men eating day after day on the open range, and why did their meals become both a survival strategy and a slow-acting poison that reshaped settlement patterns across the American West? The image we carry of cowboy cuisine, shaped by Hollywood and dime novels, centers on beans and coffee, maybe a strip of jerky gnawed by firelight. The reality was far stranger and more desperate. Cowboys on long drives, homesteaders staking claims in the Dakota Territory, and prospectors threading through the Sangre de Cristo Mountains ate foods that would be unrecognizable on any modern table. Ingredients dictated not by preference but by brutal geography, unreliable supply lines, and the constant calculus of spoilage. These meals tell a story of expansion that history books gloss over. The grinding, nutritional cost of pushing a population across a continent faster than infrastructure could follow. Every skillet of desiccated offal, every pot of alkali-tainted stew, was a small wager that the body could endure long enough to stake a claim, drive a herd to railhead, or survive until the next resupply wagon rattled in from distant depots. Trail cooks, many of them black or Mexican cowboys whose names were rarely recorded in ledgers or correspondence, became the most valuable men on a cattle drive, more essential than ropers or even the trail boss on particularly grueling stretches. They worked from the back of a chuck wagon, a mobile pantry patented by Charles Goodnight in 1866, equipped with drawers for coffee, flour, salt pork, and a water barrel that often ran dry or turned brackish. The cook rose before dawn, sometimes as early as 3 in the morning, to start a fire with dried buffalo chips or mesquite when wood was scarce. The first meal he prepared, and the one that sustained cowboys through 16-hour days in the saddle, was a dish called kush, a skillet concoction of cornmeal mush fried in bacon grease, sometimes studded with chunks of salt pork, or, when supplies dwindled, nothing but the rendered fat itself. Cowboys ate it scalding hot, scooping it with hardtack biscuits or their hands, because delay meant it would congeal into a waxy mass that clung to the roof of the mouth. If you're the kind of person who wants to know what really happened on the frontier beyond the sanitized myths, subscribe now, because we're going deeper into the meals that broke bodies and shaped borders, and most of this evidence only survived in forgotten supply, manifests and coroner's reports. Kush was calories, nothing more. It lacked vitamin C, vitamin A, and any trace of the nutrients that prevented the diseases Goodnight mentioned in his testimony, but it was cheap, stable, and could be prepared in under 15 minutes, which made it the backbone of trail food from Texas to Montana. The monotony alone was a psychological burden. Drovers on the Chisholm Trail, which funneled cattle from San Antonio to Kansas railheads, reported eating kush or minor variations of it for breakfast on 70 consecutive days during peak driving season. One cowboy, writing in a diary now held by the Kansas State Historical Society, described the taste as like licking a cast-iron skillet that's been greased and left in the sun. Yet without it, the entire economic machinery of the cattle industry would have stalled, because no other food could be prepared quickly enough to get 24 men fed, mounted, and moving livestock by first light. The second meal that defined cowboy survival, especially in the borderlands where Anglo, Tejano, and Apache foodways collided, was something called vinegar pie, though the name is misleading because it contained no fruit and was rarely sweet. It was a custard made from water, flour, sugar when available, a splash of vinegar or citric acid powder, and sometimes eggs if the chuck wagon had managed to keep a few hens alive in a crate lashed to the wagon bed. The vinegar was critical. Scurvy was rampant on long drives because fresh vegetables spoiled within days and citrus was impossible to transport across the southern plains in summer heat. Cooks discovered, partly through trial and error, and partly from knowledge passed down by sailors and military quartermasters, that acetic acid could mask the symptoms of scurvy long enough to get men to the end of a drive. It didn't cure the condition, but it bought time, and time was the currency that mattered most when a herd needed to reach Abilene or Dodge City before the market price collapsed. Vinegar pie was also a currency of morale, a rare approximation of dessert in an environment where sugar was hoarded like gold. Cooks served it on paydays, after river crossings, or when tensions among the crew threatened to boil over into violence. The psychological effect was real. A cowboy named James C. Shaw, who rode with the legendary Xit Ranch in the Texas Panhandle during the 1880s, wrote in his memoirs that a slice of vinegar pie could settle a dispute faster than a foreman's fist because it signaled that the cook, and by extension the outfit, still had enough supplies to waste a little flour and sugar on something that wasn't strictly survival rations. But the pie carried a darker edge. The acetic acid consumed day after day eroded tooth enamel and inflamed stomach linings already stressed by salt pork and alkali water. Dental records from frontier graves, studied by bioarchaeologists in the 1990s, show patterns of severe enamel loss and abscesses consistent with acidic diets, a small detail that points to a larger truth. The meals that made westward expansion possible also extracted a permanent toll on the bodies of the men who ate them. The third meal, and perhaps the most culturally significant, was son of a bitch stew, a name used openly in trail camp vernacular and recorded in dozens of first-hand accounts, including those by Teddy Roosevelt during his ranching years in the Dakota Badlands. This was an awful stew made from the internal organs of a freshly slaughtered calf, the heart, liver, tongue, brains, kidneys, and a crucial ingredient called the marrow gut, a tube connecting the two stomachs of a calf that, when cleaned and chopped, released a fatty, semi-digested curd that thickened the stew and gave it a slick, unctuous texture. The dish was prepared only when a calf was butchered on the trail, which meant it was reserved for special occasions or moments of crisis when a cow went lame or a calf couldn't keep pace with the herd. Cowboys considered it a delicacy, not because it tasted good by any objective measure, but because it represented fresh meat and a break from the relentless rotation of salt pork and beans. The stew's ingredients reveal something deeper about frontier food culture. Offal was used because muscle meat, the cuts we recognize as steaks and roasts, had to be preserved by salting or drying for future meals, and that process took time and salt, both of which were finite. The organs, however, spoiled within hours in the heat, so they had to be cooked and consumed immediately. This created a ritual around son of a bitch stew, a shared meal that brought the entire crew together around the fire, often late at night after the herd was bedded down. It was one of the few moments when hierarchy dissolved, when the trail boss ate from the same pot as the youngest wrangler, and that social function mattered as much as the nutrition. But the stew also marked men as outsiders when they returned to settled towns. The smell of offal, the willingness to eat brains and marrow gut, became a signifier of the cowboys' distance from civilization, a marker that these men had crossed a threshold and become something different, something that polite society in St. Louis or Chicago found both fascinating and repellent. The fourth meal that sustained life on the frontier, particularly among homesteaders rather than drovers, was dried corn mush mixed with wild greens, a dish that indigenous plains tribes had refined over centuries and that white settlers adopted out of necessity when wheat flour became unavailable. This happened frequently along the migration routes into Kansas and Nebraska during the 1870s, when grasshopper plagues destroyed crops and supply wagons from the east were delayed by early snows or broken axles on rutted roads. Women, who did most of the cooking in homestead cabins, foraged for lamb's quarters, purslane, and pigweed, boiled them to bitterness, and stirred them into cornmeal porridge to add bulk and a semblance of nutrition. The greens provided some vitamin C and iron, enough to keep scurvy and anemia at bay, but the labor required to gather, clean, and prepare them was enormous, often taking an entire morning for a single pot that would feed a family for 2 days. This meal illuminates a largely invisible story about frontier survival, the transfer of indigenous food knowledge to Anglo settlers, usually mediated by women and rarely acknowledged in official accounts. Homesteader diaries, particularly those written by women in Kansas and Oklahoma Territory, contain references to Indian greens and note that neighboring tribes or mixed-blood families taught them which plants were edible and which would cause vomiting or worse. This exchange was rarely peaceful or mutual. The same settlers who learned to identify purslane in the spring were often participants, directly or passively, in the dispossession of the tribes whose ecological knowledge they borrowed. The irony is stark. The meals that allowed white families to survive their first winters on stolen land were composed of ingredients and techniques developed by the people they were displacing. That contradiction never resolved itself, and it lingered in the social fabric of the plains long after the frontier officially closed in 1890. The fifth meal, less well known but widely consumed in mining camps and railroad construction sites, was cracklings mixed with lye hominy, a combination that sounds almost inedible to modern palates but was a staple for workers building the Transcontinental Railroad. In the late 1860s, cracklings were the crispy remnants left after rendering pork fat into lard, essentially fried pigskin and connective tissue hard as wood and nearly imperishable. Hominy was field corn treated with lye to remove the hull, a process borrowed directly from Native American cooking traditions, but industrialized by contract suppliers who shipped barrels of it to remote camps. The two ingredients were mixed together with boiling water, sometimes a little bacon grease, and eaten as a thick porridge that provided enough calories and fat to fuel 12-hour shifts of grading, tunneling, and track laying. The workers who ate this, predominantly Chinese laborers on the Central Pacific and Irish immigrants on the Union Pacific, experienced malnutrition at rates that only became clear decades later when researchers analyzed payroll records, mortality logs, and skeletal remains from hastily marked graves along the right-of-way. The lye in the hominy, while necessary to make the corn digestible, leached calcium from bones over time, and the absence of fresh vegetables led to beriberi and scurvy outbreaks that railroad companies attributed to constitutional weakness rather than dietary deficiency. Labor historians have argued that the speed of railroad construction, often celebrated as a triumph of American engineering, was subsidized by the physical degradation of the men who built it, and the meals they were fed played a direct role in that equation. The cracklings and hominy were cheap, they were filling, and they allowed the companies to minimize supply costs while maximizing output, a trade-off in which the workers had no voice. The sixth meal that shaped the frontier experience, particularly in the years following the Civil War, was dried apple stack cake, a layered creation that originated in Appalachia and migrated west, with families resettling in Missouri, Arkansas, and eastern Kansas. The cake was made from stiff biscuit dough, rolled thin and baked in a skillet, then stacked with layers of dried apples that had been stewed with sorghum molasses or honey. The apples, dried in the fall and stored in cloth sacks, provided one of the few sources of preserved fruit available to families who couldn't afford canned goods or who lived too far from rail depots to access them. The cake was dense, barely sweet, and required strong teeth to chew, but it could be baked in advance and carried in a wagon for weeks without spoiling, which made it a valuable food for families on the move. The social role of apple stack cake extended beyond nutrition. It was a wedding tradition brought from the Southern Highlands, where each guest at a wedding contributed a layer, and the height of the finished cake reflected the couple's standing in the community. This custom persisted in frontier settlements where social cohesion was fragile and rituals mattered. A family that could produce a multi-layered apple cake signaled that they had surplus, that they had neighbors willing to contribute, and that they were embedded in a network of mutual aid. In places where law enforcement was absent or corrupt, where claim jumping and water rights disputes could turn lethal, these edible signals of alliance and reciprocity carried real weight. The cake was a meal, yes, but it was also a social contract, a way of marking who belonged and who didn't, and that function became more important as settlements grew and resources became scarce. The seventh and perhaps most desperate meal consumed on the frontier was prairie dog stew, eaten primarily by prospectors, buffalo hunters, and soldiers stationed at remote outposts in the territories. Prairie dogs, despite the name, are rodents, and their meat is lean, gamey, and extremely tough unless boiled for hours. The stew was prepared by skinning the animals, gutting them, and throwing the entire carcass into a pot with water, salt, and whatever wild onions or roots could be found. It was a food of last resort consumed when ammunition was too scarce to hunt larger game, when supply wagons were overdue, or when a prospector's grub stake ran out in the middle of the Nevada desert or the Black Hills. Accounts of prairie dog consumption are scattered through military reports and miners' journals, often written with a tone of grim humor or outright shame. Captain Randolph Marcy, whose guidebook for overland emigrants was published in 1859, mentioned prairie dog as an emergency protein, but warned that the flavor was disagreeable to most palates, and that the animals sometimes carried plague, though the disease mechanism wasn't understood at the time. Despite the risks, men ate it because starvation was the alternative, and starvation closed mines, ended expeditions, and left bones to bleach in gulches that no one would find for decades. The willingness to eat prairie dog marked a psychological threshold. It meant you had moved past the foods of civilization, past even the improvised trail rations of cowboys, into a zone where survival stripped away every pretense and every preference. The men who crossed that line and lived often found it difficult to return to normal society, not because they couldn't readjust, but because the experience left them changed in ways that were hard to articulate and harder to forget. These 7 meals taken together form a hidden narrative of westward expansion, one that doesn't appear in the heroic accounts of manifest destiny or the nostalgic mythology of the Old West. They reveal a frontier defined not by triumph but by endurance, where success meant outlasting the land, the weather, and your own body's declining ability to process the relentless sameness of salt, grease, and acid. The long-term consequences of these diets rippled forward in ways that few historians have traced. Dental disease, gastrointestinal disorders, and vitamin deficiencies were endemic among frontier populations, and these conditions didn't vanish when settlements became towns and towns became cities. They were passed down in the form of inherited health vulnerabilities and cultural attitudes toward food that prioritized cheapness and shelf stability over nutrition, attitudes that still shape rural food culture in parts of the Great Plains and the Mountain West. The violence of the frontier, too, was connected to these meals in ways that are difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore. Men suffering from chronic malnutrition from the constant low-grade inflammation caused by acidic and rancid foods were more irritable, more prone to escalate disputes, and less capable of the kind of steady judgment that might have prevented some of the shootings, lynchings, and range wars that scarred the era. The infamous conflicts over water rights, grazing boundaries, and cattle rustling were driven by economic incentives. Certainly, but they unfolded in a context where physical discomfort was constant, and where the body's stress responses were already heightened by dietary deprivation. To understand the violence of the frontier, you have to understand the meals that preceded it, the hunger that was never quite satisfied, and the bodily toll that made patience a scarce commodity. The legacy of cowboy cuisine also played out in the development of the American food industry. The techniques used to preserve and transport food across vast distances. The reliance on canned goods, dried staples, and shelf-stable fats became the foundation for the processed food systems that dominated the 20th century. The same logic that made salt pork and hardtack essential on the Chisholm Trail made Spam and crackers essential in military rations and later in suburban pantries. The frontier was a testing ground for industrial food, a place where the priority was always durability and cost, never flavor or health, and that priority embedded itself in the national food culture so deeply that we still live with its consequences, in the form of obesity, diabetes, and food deserts that map closely onto the old frontier zones, where fresh food was always a distant luxury, and preservation was survival. These forgotten meals remind us that history is lived in the body before it's recorded in books, and that the grand movements of nations, the opening of territories and the closing of frontiers are built on the small, relentless acts of eating and enduring. The cowboys, homesteaders, and railroad workers who choked down son-of-a-bitch stew and vinegar pie didn't think of themselves as making history. They thought of themselves as getting through the day. But in those acts of survival, repeated thousands of times across thousands of miles, they built the scaffold on which a modern nation took shape, and the cost was written in their teeth, their guts, and the graves that line forgotten trails.